September 1st, 1939. At dawn, German troops crossed the Polish frontier in a coordinated assault of infantry, armor, and aircraft. It was swift, decisive, and merciless. Columns of soldiers advanced with confidence, convinced that history itself was finally moving in Germany's favor. To many observers, this moment appeared sudden an eruption of violence after years of uneasy peace. But the invasion of Poland was not the beginning of the story. Its true origins lay buried in an earlier March, one not of conquest, but of retreat. Barely 20 years earlier, German soldiers had walked back into their homeland in silence. Their uniforms were worn, their faces hollow, their morale shattered. They had not been paraded as defeated men. There were no enemy troops occupying Berlin, no foreign flags flew above German cities. Yet the war was over, and Germany had lost. In November 1918, the German Empire collapsed under the weight of military failure, economic exhaustion, and political revolt. After 4 years of industrialized slaughter, the armies of Britain, France, and the newly arrived United States had broken the stalemate on the Western Front. German lines were crumbling. Supplies were gone, morale had disintegrated. At home, civilians were starving. The British naval blockade had strangled Germany's economy and food supply. By the final year of the war, malnutrition was widespread. Children and the elderly were the first to die. Cities were filled with queues for bread that often never came. The promise of victory that had sustained the population in 1914 had evaporated. In early November, sailors in the German Navy mutinied rather than sail on what they believed would be a final suicide mission. Their rebellion spread rapidly, igniting strikes and uprisings across the country. Workers' councils formed. Red flags appeared in major cities. Revolution loomed. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated the throne and fled into exile. The German monarchy, one of Europe's most powerful empires, ceased to exist in a single day. 2 days later, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, an armistice was signed in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne. The guns of World War I fell silent, but silence did not bring peace. For many Germans, the end of the war felt incomprehensible. Their armies had not been annihilated. No enemy had marched through Berlin. Soldiers returned believing they had held the line, believing they had been undefeated in battle. This perception would become lethal. Almost immediately, senior military leaders and nationalist politicians began constructing a dangerous explanation for defeat. They claimed that Germany had not lost the war militarily, but politically that it had been betrayed from within. According to this narrative, civilian politicians, socialists, Jews, and Democrats had undermined the war effort and forced an unnecessary surrender. This idea became known as the stab-in-the-back myth. It was false. Germany had been defeated. Its armies were collapsing. Its economy was broken. But the myth took root because it offered something far more powerful than truth: absolution. Responsibility for failure was displaced. The army remained pure, the nation's pride was preserved, and resentment was given a target. As the guns fell silent, Europe gathered to decide the future. In December 1918, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson arrived on the continent as a symbol of hope. He spoke of a new international order, one based on self-determination, collective security, and open diplomacy. His vision promised a break from the old system of secret alliances and imperial rivalries that had led to catastrophe. At the Palace of Versailles in 1919, the victors of the war, Britain, France, and their allies, set about reshaping the map of Europe. Empires vanished. The Austro-Hungarian Empire disintegrated into a patchwork of new states. The Ottoman Empire collapsed. From the ruins emerged nations such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, countries that had not existed on maps before the war. Germany, meanwhile, was summoned not to negotiate, but to accept. Under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany lost approximately 13% of its territory and 10% of its population. Its overseas colonies were confiscated. Its army was limited to 100,000 men. Tanks, submarines, and an air force were forbidden. The Rhineland was demilitarized, leaving Germany's western frontier exposed. Perhaps most damaging of all was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for the war. Too many Germans. This was unbearable. The treaty also imposed massive reparations. Britain and France, both devastated by the war and burdened with debt, demanded compensation. Germany was ordered to pay £6.6 billion, a sum so large it would dominate its politics and economy for years. The payments were not merely financial, they were symbolic. Each installment reinforced the idea of national humiliation. The treaty was signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. German delegates signed under protest, aware that refusal would mean renewed war. When the news reached Germany, crowds gathered in anger and despair. The word diktat spread or dictated peace. The settlement contained another, quieter flaw. While new nations were created in the name of self-determination, their borders were imperfect. Millions of ethnic Germans found themselves living outside Germany's new frontiers in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Austria. The idea that these people should one day be reunited with the German homeland did not disappear. It was merely postponed. The war had ended, but grievances remained unresolved. Wilson's vision depended heavily on the League of Nations, an international body designed to prevent future conflict through dialogue and collective action. For a brief moment, it seemed that a new era might begin. Then the United States turned inward. When Wilson returned home, the U.S. Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. America did not join the League of Nations. The institution meant to enforce the peace was left without the world's most powerful economy and military. The architect of the new order walked away from it. Germany, meanwhile, became a republic almost by accident. In the chaos of revolution and defeat, democratic leaders proclaimed a new government in the town of Weimar. It promised elections, civil rights, and parliamentary rule. On paper, it was modern and progressive. In reality, it was fragile. The new democracy inherited not only defeat, but blame. Many Germans associated Republican politicians with surrender and humiliation. The old elite army officers, judges, industrialists remained largely untouched and deeply hostile to democratic rule. Germany was now a democracy without legitimacy. The war had ended, but psychologically, Germany had never accepted defeat. The peace had arrived, but it brought instability rather than closure. The institutions meant to safeguard the future lacked authority. The myths meant to explain the past grew stronger with each passing month. This was not peace built on reconciliation. It was a pause filled with unresolved anger. And in that pause, the foundations were laid not for recovery, but for revenge. The German Republic was born in defeat. In 1919, the new democratic state soon known as the Weimar Republic faced a task no government in modern Europe had ever survived unscarred: rebuilding a nation that had lost a total war, accepted a humiliating peace, and remained deeply divided over what that defeat meant. Its constitution promised universal suffrage, civil liberties, and parliamentary rule. On paper, it was among the most progressive political systems in the world. In practice, it stood on unstable ground. From its first days, the Republic was under siege from both extremes. On the left, communist revolutionaries inspired by the Bolshevik victory in Russia believed Germany was on the brink of socialist transformation. On the right, nationalist veterans, monarchists, and paramilitary groups saw democracy as a betrayal imposed by traitors. Violence quickly replaced debate. In January 1919, communist forces launched an uprising in Berlin, hoping to overthrow the new government. The Weimar leaders, terrified of a Soviet-style revolution, turned to right-wing paramilitary units known as the Freikorps for help. These groups were composed largely of embittered veterans who rejected democracy and glorified violence. The uprising was crushed. Its leaders were executed without trial. The decision would haunt the Republic. By relying on anti-democratic forces to preserve order, the government weakened its own moral authority. The message was clear: democracy would survive only by making deals with those who despised it. Throughout the early 1920s, Germany became a battlefield of ideologies. Political assassinations became commonplace. Ministers, journalists, and moderate politicians were targeted by extremist groups. Courts, staffed largely by judges appointed under the old empire, treated right-wing offenders with leniency while punishing left-wing activists harshly. Justice was not blind, it leaned. The army, meanwhile, remained a state within a state. Although formally loyal to the Republic, its leadership never fully accepted civilian control or democratic legitimacy. Many officers privately blamed politicians for Germany's defeat and resented the restrictions imposed by Versailles. The Republic survived, but it did not command loyalty. Then came economic collapse. The war had left Germany financially exhausted. Reparations payments loomed large over every budget decision. When Germany fell behind on payments in 1923, France and Belgium responded by occupying the Ruhr, the industrial heartland of the country. The German government called for passive resistance. Workers went on strike, production halted. To pay striking workers and maintain basic services, the state printed money. The result was catastrophe. Hyperinflation spiraled out of control, prices doubled, then tripled, then became meaningless. By late 1923, a loaf of bread could cost billions of marks. Workers were paid twice a day if they could rush to shops before prices rose again. Savings accumulated over a lifetime were wiped out in weeks. Middle-class Germans, once the backbone of social stability, were ruined. Pensions became worthless. Professionals sold furniture to survive. Teachers and clerks found themselves poorer than unskilled laborers. The belief that hard work and responsibility led to security collapsed alongside the currency. Trust in democratic government evaporated. The crisis did not radicalize Germany overnight, but it planted something deeper, a sense that democracy was incapable of protecting ordinary people from chaos. When the government finally stabilized the currency by introducing a new mark, the damage had already been done. Resentment lingered long after inflation ended. It was in this atmosphere of anger, fear, and humiliation that radical movements flourished. Many Germans no longer wanted compromise or complexity. They wanted certainty, they wanted blame assigned and solutions promised. Among the voices offering those promises was a former soldier named Adolf Hitler. Born in Austria, Hitler had served as a messenger on the Western Front during World War I. He experienced defeat personally and internalized the myth of betrayal deeply. After the war, he settled in Munich, a city teeming with nationalist resentment and political extremism. Hitler possessed no formal education or political experience. What he had was a gift for rhetoric. His speeches were theatrical, emotional, and uncompromising. He spoke not of policy, but of destiny, betrayal, and rebirth. By 1921, he had become the leader of a small extremist organization, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Despite its name, it was neither socialist nor focused on workers' rights. Its ideology combined aggressive nationalism, anti-Semitism, rejection of democracy, and an obsession with overturning Versailles. Hitler's movement grew rapidly in Bavaria, where conservative elites tolerated extremism, the bulwark against communism. Paramilitary units known as the SA stormtroopers dressed in brown uniforms were formed to intimidate opponents and project strength. Politics increasingly resembled street warfare. In November 1923, amid economic chaos and political instability, Hitler made his move. Inspired by Benito Mussolini's successful march on Rome, he attempted to seize power in Munich in what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. The coup failed. Police opened fire on the marchers. 60 Nazis were killed. Hitler was arrested and charged with treason. His movement appeared finished. Instead, the trial gave him a national platform. In court, Hitler portrayed himself as a patriot acting out of love for Germany. Sympathetic judges allowed him to speak at length. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison but served only 9 months. During his imprisonment, Hitler dictated a book that would define his future path, Mein Kampf. The text laid out a worldview shaped by grievance and obsession. It blamed Germany's defeat on Jews and internal enemies, rejected the Treaty of Versailles entirely, and called for territorial expansion eastward to secure living space for the German people. But it also revealed a crucial shift in strategy. Hitler concluded that power would not be taken by force alone. The failed putsch had taught him that democracy did not be smashed from the outside, it had to be hollowed out from within. When he was released from prison in 1924, Hitler committed publicly to pursuing power through legal means. For a time, this decision seemed irrelevant. Between 1924 and 1929, Germany experienced a period of relative stability. With the help of American loans and international agreements, the economy recovered. Industry expanded, cities flourished culturally. Extremist parties lost support. In elections, the Nazi Party performed poorly. Many believed the crisis had passed, but the recovery was fragile, dependent on foreign credit and global confidence. Beneath the surface, the structural weaknesses of the Republic remained unresolved. Democratic institutions were accepted conditionally, not embraced. Economic security rested on borrowed money. Political moderation was tolerated only so long as prosperity lasted. The illusion of stability masked unresolved fear. When the world economy collapsed in October 1929, Germany's foundations would be tested again. And this time, the Republic would not recover. In October 1929, the illusion shattered. The collapse of the New York Stock Exchange sent shockwaves across the global economy, but nowhere outside the United States did the consequences strike harder than in Germany. The apparent prosperity of the mid-1920s had rested on a fragile foundation of American loans and short-term credit. When those funds were suddenly withdrawn, Germany's economic structure imploded almost overnight. Factories closed, banks failed, businesses collapsed in waves. By 1932, more than 6 million Germans were unemployed, nearly one-third of the workforce. For millions more, wages were slashed and hours reduced. Welfare systems, already strained, buckled under the pressure. Breadlines returned, soup kitchens multiplied. Once again, ordinary Germans faced hunger, humiliation, and fear. But this time, the crisis felt different. In 1923, hyperinflation had destroyed savings but left jobs intact. Now, work itself vanished. Men stood idle in the streets, stripped not only of income but of purpose. Families crowded into cold apartments, listening to political speeches crackle over radios, searching for anyone who could explain why this was happening again. Faith in democracy evaporated rapidly. The Weimar political system proved incapable of responding decisively. Coalition governments collapsed in quick succession. Parliamentary debates dragged on while the economy disintegrated. Emergency decrees issued by President Paul von Hindenburg replaced normal legislation, undermining democracy in the name of preserving it. To many Germans, democracy no longer looked like stability, it looked like paralysis. In this vacuum, extremist parties surged. The Communist Party promised revolution and the destruction of capitalism. The Nazi Party promised unity, revival, and revenge. Between them, the political center was crushed. Moderation became invisible, compromise became a weakness. Adolf Hitler returned to the national stage with ruthless precision. His message had not changed, but the audience had. He blamed the economic collapse on the same enemies he had named years earlier: the Treaty of Versailles, democratic politicians, Marxists, and Jews. He promised jobs, order, and national rebirth. Above all, he promised to make Germany strong again. The Nazi Party transformed itself into a mass movement. Modern propaganda techniques were deployed with chilling effectiveness. Posters flooded cities and villages, loudspeakers blared speeches in market squares. Aircraft carried Hitler from rally to rally, projecting an image of tireless leadership and modern dynamism. Violence accompanied persuasion. By 1931, The Nazi Party's paramilitary wing, the SA, numbered nearly 3 million men. Clashes between brown-shirted stormtroopers and communist fighters became a daily occurrence. Streets turned into battlegrounds. Fear became routine. Crucially, this violence was not a failure of strategy, it was the strategy. Chaos created demand for order. Fear made authoritarian promises attractive. As Germany descended into instability, Hitler positioned himself as the only figure capable of restoring calm. In the elections of 1932, the Nazis achieved a stunning breakthrough. They became the largest party in the Reichstag, yet they lacked an outright majority. Hitler demanded the chancellorship, refusing to serve under anyone else. The political system ground to a halt. Conservative elites, industrialists, landowners, and senior officials believed they could exploit Hitler's popularity while controlling him from behind the scenes. They feared communism more than authoritarianism and saw the Nazi movement as a useful weapon. In January 1933, President Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor of Germany. It was a legal decision, no coup, no revolution. Within weeks, the consequences became irreversible. On the night of February 27, 1933, the Reichstag building went up in flames. Hitler immediately blamed the communists, claiming Germany faced an imminent uprising. He demanded emergency powers to protect the nation. Hindenburg signed the Reichstag Fire Decree. Civil liberties were suspended, freedom of speech, press, and assembly vanished overnight. Thousands of political opponents were arrested without trial. The machinery of repression moved swiftly and efficiently, cloaked in legality. Elections held in March took place in an atmosphere of terror. The Nazis still failed to win an outright majority, but it no longer mattered. Later that month, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act, granting Hitler the power to legislate without parliamentary approval. The democratic system dismantled itself through lawful procedure. Germany did not fall into dictatorship screaming. It applauded. Opposition parties were banned. Trade unions were dissolved. Political pluralism vanished. By mid-1933, Germany had become a one-party state. Yet consolidation of power was not complete. Within the Nazi movement itself, rivalries and threats remained. The SA, with its millions of armed men, frightened conservative elites and the army. Its leader, Ernst Röhm, spoke openly of a second revolution. In June 1934, Hitler acted. During what became known as the Night of the Long Knives, the regime carried out a coordinated purge. Röhm and dozens of SA leaders were executed, along with other perceived enemies. The army pledged loyalty to Hitler. Conservative supporters exhaled in relief. Order, it seemed, had been restored. In August 1934, President Hindenburg died. Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President, declaring himself Führer of the German Reich. The army swore a personal oath of loyalty not to the Constitution, but to Hitler himself. Applause echoed across Germany. For many, the chaos of the previous decade appeared finally over. Jobs were promised. Streets felt safer. Political conflict vanished not because it was resolved, but because it was crushed. Germany had traded freedom for stability. And for the moment, it appeared to have worked. By 1934, Germany appeared transformed. The years of political paralysis, street violence, and economic despair seemed to be fading into memory. Adolf Hitler stood at the pinnacle of power, unchallenged and widely popular. To millions of Germans, he embodied discipline, confidence, and national revival. The chaos of the Weimar years had ended not through compromise, but through control. For a society exhausted by instability, the result felt like salvation. Hitler moved quickly to consolidate this perception. His regime focused first on restoring economic confidence, knowing that legitimacy would rest not only on ideology, but on tangible improvement in daily life. Massive public works programs were launched. Roads, bridges, and housing projects spread across the country. The most visible symbol of this effort was the construction of the Autobahn network, vast highways stretching across Germany. Presented as proof of modernity, and national purpose. Unemployment fell dramatically. To many Germans, the explanation was simple: Hitler had delivered what democracy could not. Men who had spent years idle now wore uniforms or carried tools. Wages stabilized. Shops reopened. The sense of humiliation that had defined the post-war period seemed to be lifting. What was less visible, but far more consequential, was how this recovery was being achieved. Behind the facade of civilian prosperity, Germany was preparing for war. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed strict military limitations. Germany's army was restricted to 100,000 men. Conscription was banned. Tanks, heavy artillery, submarines, and an air force were forbidden outright. These provisions were designed to prevent Germany from ever again threatening European peace. Hitler ignored them. At first, rearmament was concealed. Weapons were developed in secret. Military training took place under civilian disguises. Officers studied modern warfare in violation of international agreements. Arms factories expanded quietly, often hidden within civilian industries, but secrecy did not last long. In 1935, Hitler openly renounced the military restrictions of Versailles. Conscription was reintroduced. The army expanded rapidly. Most dramatically, he unveiled the existence of the Luftwaffe, a modern German air force equipped with approximately 2,500 aircraft. This force alone exceeded the combined air strength of Britain and France. The announcement was not met with war. Instead, it was met with hesitation, debate, and ultimately silence. Britain and France protested diplomatically, but no concrete action followed. Their governments were haunted by the memory of World War I. Millions were dead. Entire generations had been lost. The desire to avoid another conflict outweighed the urge to confront a treaty violation. Many leaders convinced themselves that Hitler's actions were understandable. Germany, they argued, had been treated too harshly in 1919. Restoring a basic level of military parity seemed reasonable. Rearmament, framed as defensive rather than aggressive, was tolerated. The belief spread that satisfying grievances might stabilize Europe rather than endanger it. This assumption would prove fatal. Inside Germany, rearmament fueled economic growth and national pride. Arms production absorbed labor. Military parades filled streets with banners and music. The regime carefully staged spectacles of unity and strength, reinforcing the illusion that Germany's resurgence was peaceful, controlled, and justified. Each violation of Versailles became a test, each test met with an action. Encouraged by foreign passivity, Hitler began taking territorial steps. In January 1935, the Saarländer coal-rich region placed under League of Nations administration after the war held a plebiscite to determine its future. Over 90% voted to return to German control. The result was celebrated as a triumph of self-determination and national unity. It was also a warning. Later that same year, Hitler took a far more dangerous gamble. In March 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland region bordering France that had been demilitarized under the Treaty of Versailles. The move was a direct challenge to the post-war order. German forces crossed the Rhine under strict orders to retreat if confronted. They were not. France, politically divided and unwilling to act without British support, remained passive. Britain, viewing the move as Germany reclaiming its own territory, saw no cause for war. The gamble succeeded. Hitler later admitted that the reoccupation of the Rhineland had been his greatest risk. Had French troops intervened, the German army would have withdrawn. The regime's prestige might have collapsed. Instead, the opposite occurred. His confidence soared, so did his popularity. To Germans, the message was unmistakable: the world would not stop them. International institutions proved powerless. The League of Nations, already weakened by American absence and internal divisions, issued condemnations without enforcement. Collective security, the foundation of the post-war peace, existed in theory, but not in action. Stability, once again, was an illusion. While Europe focused on borders and treaties, darker developments unfolded within Germany itself. The regime's racial ideology, outlined years earlier in Mein Kampf, now hardened into law. In 1935, the Nuremberg Laws were enacted. Jews were stripped of German citizenship. Marriages and sexual relationships between Jews and so-called Aryans were banned. Jews were excluded from professions, education, and public life. These measures were presented as legal, orderly, and civilized. They were none of those things. They marked the formal exclusion of an entire population from national life, based purely on race. Violence did not yet dominate the streets, but discrimination was now state policy. The legal framework for persecution had been established. Abroad, reactions were muted. Some governments expressed concern, others remained silent. Many observers believed that Germany's internal policies, however troubling, were not grounds for international confrontation. The priority remained peace. That same year, Berlin hosted the 1936 Olympic Games. The event was a triumph of propaganda. The city was cleaned, anti-Semitic signs were temporarily removed. Foreign visitors were greeted with hospitality and efficiency. Germany appeared modern, disciplined, and peaceful. The illusion worked. For a brief moment, the Nazi regime looked respectable. Athletic achievement and ceremonial grandeur distracted from repression and rearmament. Many left believing that fears about Germany had been exaggerated. They were wrong. Behind the scenes, the machinery of expansion continued to accelerate. Military planning intensified, ideological indoctrination deepened. The regime no longer questioned whether it could defy the post-war order, only how far it could go without resistance. Europe watched, misread, and waited. The world had mistaken calm for safety, recovery for restraint, and legality for legitimacy. The path to war was no longer hidden. It had been revealed step by step, violation by violation, silence by silence. When the next crisis came, when German troops once again marched across borders, it would not come unexpectedly. It would come from a world that had failed to understand the meaning of what it had already allowed.